We're glad to have you again as the Interamerican Adventist Theological Seminary. And in this opportunity, we're going to speak about Christians and their civic duties. And we have the opportunity of having Dr. Nicholas Miller.
Good to be with you.
Good to have you, Nick.
Thank you.
You're enjoying the sun of Interamerica. How that feels?
It's certainly warmer than the northeastern United States has been recently.
That's
it's pleasant to be here among the warmth of the sun and the warmth of the Puerto Rican people.
That's right, and thank you for making this your second home. We're glad to have you here. And in this opportunity, we want to know a little bit more about you. You have practiced law for many years. Can you tell us about that?
It's true. I first studied theology at Pacific Union College, but I felt called to religious liberty work. And so I was pre-law, and I went off to law school in New York City, and I practiced for about a dozen years with the government, with private firms, but I specialized in constitutional law and especially the law of church and state, and worked and wrote in that area for many years. And then in the early 2000s, I was approached by Andrews University to do further study, to do a PhD in a religious and legal history, and help them operate a religious liberty center at Andrews University and teach in the church history department there.
And that's how many of our viewers perhaps have known you, through your writings or your presentations. You know, worldwide they have used as a reference you on issues of church and state, religious liberty, also about perhaps, you know, how we deal with our civic duties. And that's our interest in this opportunity. How Christians should understand issues of civic duty?
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, the Bible provides a variety of answers because states behave in a variety of ways. Sometimes they do what Romans 13 says they should, and they reward good and they punish evil. And when the governments do that, it's an easy thing for Christians and citizens to support and respect and obey the government. The questions become more difficult. What happens when governments perhaps might uphold evil and punish good? Because we know that governments sometimes do that. And it's clear that Paul, in writing the book of Romans, had to write carefully because he was writing to Rome. So he didn't necessarily spell all of that out in Romans. We have to read it between the lines. But also if we read the books of Daniel and Revelation and we read the teachings of Christ, we see that there are times and places where there might need to be some resistance to things that the government does, either to ourselves or to other people. And for our own pioneers, that came in the issue of slavery, where we felt this was unjust, that governments that enslaved people, especially on the basis of the color of their skin, were acting unrighteously, and we should oppose it. And Ellen White went so far as to say we should disobey unjust laws, and she was speaking about the fugitive slave law in her day that required people who came across runaway slaves to return them to the government and to their masters. And she said, this law we must not obey. We must be lawbreakers. So there's a range of how we need to respond to the government.
And to interact with them. So if I try to use the Bible as a cooking book, just to try to find a recipe for my next meal, it will not work that way. We have to see context.
That's right.
We have opportunities that the governments were aligned with the will of God. There were times when we had the theocracy was perhaps the darkest time during the time of the judges, where we have rulers that were obeying the Lord, others who didn't. So I guess we have to be very careful as we read scriptures, and then how we read even our church history. Those early pioneers, other than the issue of slavery, were there other issues like blue laws and other instances that there was a clash between what our pioneers practiced and what was required by the government?
Well, I mean, yes, you've mentioned another good example, the issue of blue laws, called blue laws because religious laws were written on blue paper in the early colonies. but they refer often to Sunday laws, to Sunday closing laws, to Sunday sacredness laws. And early Adventists got caught up in some of these and actually spent some time in jail in some instances. Mm-hmm. And our Religious Liberty Department was founded, at least in some part, to respond to these unjust government laws. So that is another good example. There's also examples of Adventist leaders and Ellen White herself in seeking to change or implement laws that would bring greater justice. And a good example of that, of course, is the Prohibition movement, where Ellen White spoke to the largest audiences of her life in calling for laws to prohibit the sale and the making of alcohol, the sale and use of alcohol. So we had an interaction. We weren't just a pietist group that just protected ourselves.
No.
We would advocate for either against unjust laws or for the passage of just laws.
And that happened not only in domestic issues, but as I understand, you're the historian, that issues like imperialism and how the pioneers were letting their prophetic voice to be heard on issues on empire making during the late 19th century.
Yes, it's true. The Spanish-American War, it was felt by our leaders. A.T. Jones, the famous religious liberty advocate, wrote many articles in Liberty magazine calling out America, and really this was, a political pressure in a sense, trying to get Adventists to see the inappropriateness, the hubris, the aggressiveness of using arms in a place far from home that really wasn't a defensive war. And our leaders felt we were willing to do this because of issues of race. These were brown people, not white people. For issues of religion, these were Catholics, not Protestants. And so they felt this was an example of America speaking as a dragon, and that we needed to speak out against this racism, imperialism, and Christian nationalism is what we would call it today.
So I guess if some of those firebrand pioneers were alive in the early 20th century, they will speak about the Banana Fruit Company, United Fruit Company, about the banana wars, about the invasions of the different Latin American countries, and how that has had an effect that we see now, 100 years later.
Well, on the establishment of Puerto Rico and the way that it is now, struggling economically. Most Americans in the United States don't know that Puerto Ricans are American citizens, but they have a second-class status because they have no actual representation in government, and Puerto Rico became an American territory out of the wars that Adventist pioneers prophetically critiqued as a misuse of imperialist behavior, and here we are 100 years later seeing the ongoing impact of it.
It is. And I guess we got the best part of it, because at least we have some rights that others who had their livelihood broken, they don't have, and they have to migrate illegally. So if I have to migrate because of the difficult situation that we have here, I just buy a ticket and I go. But others, they don't have that opportunity. And perhaps that's one of the issues that calls our attention right now as we see the enforcing and implementation of laws that will impact many of our church members in the United States, as other laws, similar laws, are being enacted here in Latin America. We have the Dominican Republic. We have also other countries around Venezuela that have been impacted, especially Costa Rica with their frontier with Nicaragua. So this is an ongoing issue worldwide. And how can we glean from the Bible perhaps some attitudes then toward the refugee or the migrant?
Well, this is becoming a very pressing issue. We've just had an inauguration just a little over a week ago, and there have been a flurry of executive orders that are changing rather dramatically the landscape of immigration into America. There's going to be a much harder line on who can get in and how. They've also removed the safe places, schools, hospitals, and churches. Now, government agents are allowed to go in and enter these places in seeking undocumented immigrants. And there's a whole wave of fear that is sweeping over this community, and not leaving untouched by any means our church, where many of our members in the United States from Latin American countries are not documented. And we're talking thousands and tens of thousands of our fellow believers who might be in the pews next to us, who are now living in a heightened state of fear. And the question is, what is our role and duty as citizens and also as fellow church members and brothers and sisters in Christ?
I know that we have done some actions with refugees in the past. One of the most dramatic pictures that people have is what happened during the special operation that is going on in Ukraine. So Adra was active working with the people who had to flee their motherland, and they went to Romania, to Poland, to Germany. What was the role of Adra with those refugees?
Well, as I understand it, Adra seeks to set up humanitarian camps that refugees can orient themselves, can learn what the new legal requirements are in the country that they've come to, so that they can seek for work, employment, and education in ways that comply with the government's requirements. Adra was recently profiled isn't quite the right word, but given credit, unfairly so, in helping move migrants from Latin America up to the United States. And that's not true.
No.
What they do is they have humanitarian camps that help these migrants live lawfully and with resources in the countries where they arrive. And if Adra is successful, those people will actually want to continue to stay in those countries. If there is no humanitarian aid or the gangs are in control, it's more likely that the people will move on to seek safer locations and eventually go to the United States. So Adra and the Adventists have been unfairly targeted, and we need to cut through this misinformation. We're providing humanitarian services within the framework of the law, not encouraging people to go to other places. And that's not a fair assessment of it at all.
And I'm glad that you clarify that. I have seen this firsthand in many other places. I remember being in Congo, where many Hutus, they after Tutsis gained power again, they went to the Republic of Congo. More recently, I was in the month of August last year in the border between Thailand and Myanmar. And we have many of the Kenyan people that they have been able to cross to Thailand seeking safe haven out of the crisis that they have there. Also, the Venezuelans in Peru, Colombia, and other countries that I visit. And in a couple of weeks, I'll be in Tapachulas, the border between Guatemala and Mexico that has been threatened to be closed. So I guess the border has extended the frontiers of the United States down to Mexico. So for me, it's something dramatic, because I have known people firsthand, the tragedies, their problems, and how can we, as Christians, not empathize with the pain of others?
Well, you raise very good questions, and we should say clearly that Adra operates within the framework of the law and does not seek to have people break the laws.
Never.
But as Christians, is there ever a time when laws might be set aside in the name of higher principles? And if you are to take the Bible seriously, the answer is, in fact, has to be yes. I mean, it was famously, the disciples said, who should we obey, God or man? And when there is a conflict between those principles, then we, of course, need to obey God.
Do you have some examples in the Bible, some stories that can help us?
Well, specifically relating to migration, it's hard for some Adventists who we tend to be rule keepers and law abiders. Well, we have these undocumented immigrants. They're in our country. How can we stand up or speak for them or defend them when they've broken the rules? The government's probably doing the right thing and trying to... And, we can't say in all instances what may be the case, and criminals certainly need to be returned who've been violent.
Yes.
But on the other hand, as you've alluded, there are stories in the Bible. They didn't have immigration systems quite the same way we have today, and visas weren't quite a thing. But if you read the story, for instance, of the children of Israel journeying to the Promised Land, there's borders, and there's governments that refuse to let them through certain nations, and they have to go around other nations. Moses is a illegal immigrant or emigrant, if you will, right? He kills the Egyptian, and then he flees the country to escape the wrath of Pharaoh. He later comes back and then helps lead the children of Israel on an unlawful migration outside of the borders of a country.
In the story of Moses, we can remember all these ladies who are the midwives trying to protect the refugees. So I guess there's a difference between a refugee and a migrant. How can we perhaps see certain nuances? The difference between somebody seeking better education, better health care, more job opportunities, from the person who is a victim of violence, persecution, or other kind of hardship in that regard.
Yeah, so that's a good point. There's two categories, and they merge and overlap in some ways. But I think we can clearly see somebody who has a life that is, decent and safe in one location, but would like to develop their skills more fully and get a better job and wants to move to another country to do that, versus a person who lacks food, lacks security, who is in danger of death, or maybe not death, but of difficult coercive circumstances and impairment of their religious freedom or other kinds of freedoms, then those people are refugees. And our country recognizes this. We have a program for asylum, right? And asylum is extended to people who have genuine fear of persecution of one kind or another. And so I think we are perhaps more sympathetic to those who are refugee status, leaving behind real dangers. And the Bible seems to allow for refugees to sometimes take matters into their own hands. We talked about Moses, we talked about the children of Israel. Maybe the most famous group of undocumented immigrants, if you define that by leaving a country contrary to the will of the civil authorities, is the Holy Family. Herod wanted to get them.
That's right.
They were warned. They left at night so people wouldn't know. Mary, Joseph, and Jesus go to Egypt and stay there, and then surreptitiously return. So it's hard to condemn all undocumented migrants as being immoral lawbreakers when the Holy Family would have fallen into that category, and therefore we must not be too quick to judge the circumstances that drove people to come to our country, maybe in not as documented a way as you and I have the privilege of being able to do. I was an immigrant. I came from England, and I was able to come with a green card, and my father worked, but I had a certain privilege in my life that allowed me to do that. And I shouldn't immediately judge those who may have more difficult circumstances and are forced to do things in a somewhat different way.
So we see that the Bible has these different circumstances, then different stories, that we should listen to those voices, and today, humbly, listen also to the stories of other people. What impact do you think the immigration laws that are being emphasized and so on will have on churches? I used to work in a church plant there next to Andrews in Lawrence, and actually 80 to 90% of the people there were undocumented. My first elder was undocumented. He had two names, and he was paying his taxes on another Social Security and so on. And that raised some questions that I had to had conversations with him about consistency and coherency. But tell me about the impact that these laws will have on, or these new orders will have on church members.
Well, it's certainly going to create a much higher level of fear. It's going to create a climate of fear that the immigrant community already doesn't want to interact too much with authorities, because if it's discovered that they're undocumented, you may be gone. And there's already stories, of course, people who commit crimes are the first to be deported, but now we're hearing stories of people who have traffic infractions, that this can be the basis for them being out of the country. And, if you're injured, if you're the victim of some crime or spousal abuse, or you're not going to want to report it because you could lose your livelihood and be sent away to another country. So we're going to need to look for ways to support our brothers and sisters who may have genuine needs, whether it be medical or legal or other, that they can obtain help without feeling like they're going to jeopardize their home life, their children's life in school. Some of these folks have children that have never lived in these other countries. How would you feel if you were sent off to some place where you'd never lived before? Maybe you don't even speak the language. So there is a real moment where the Adventist Church is going to have to, in some ways, choose between upholding the law of the land in all respects and showing compassion to our fellow brothers and sisters during a time of difficulty and of trial.
And that means that perhaps we'll have to have those difficult conversations, as I had with my elder and with other people, and at the same time realizing that it's not my duty to judge. I think that I can speak about two stories. The story of the Samaritan, where we have somebody in the road that is injured, and I can just use this sanctimonious attitude, you were alone, you deserve this, and so on. And I can just go by, or be merciful to that person, to the other. And also the story of the woman caught in adultery. This woman was caught in adultery. She's sinful for sure, she deserves, the stoning, but Jesus has a different attitude. Interesting that the person who paid for sex was not there, So we choose sometimes, what sins are sinful or what sins are, not that important, acceptable, but those two stories, what do you glean from those two stories in the context of what we are experiencing today?
Well, I think that, in these stories, Christ is pointing at larger moral questions that are hidden behind the rules. We know both those stories, Samaritans are held up as kind of, in the Good Samaritan case, as a moral hero, as the person who did the right thing, more so than the priest and the Levite.
That are following the law because they were not supposed to get unclean. So they're following the law.
And the Samaritan is worshiping in the wrong place with the wrong people, and yet he is the one that is the morally pure one. And I think it demonstrates that ritualistically following ritual religious rules, or even
the letter of the law,
the letter of the civil law, may not be the righteous pathway. And there's as a lawyer, we learn early on, there's two kinds of laws. There's something called malum in se. Test your Latin today. It means the thing in itself is evil. Versus malum prohibitum, which means it's wrong because it's prohibited. Malum in se means the law, outlawing murder and theft and adultery is outlawing things that are inherently immoral. But there's other kinds of laws, zoning laws, or the size of the signs that you have, maybe some kind of traffic laws, are just wrong because the government has arbitrarily designated it that way. And immigration laws generally fall into the malum prohibitum, right? There's not lines on the earth that say you can't cross this line. It's humans that create these things. And malum prohibitum should be respected because of the authority of the government, but it's also the case that other principles may at times override, as in the case of the fugitive slave law. The malum prohibitum was overcome by moral principles of fairness and equality to human beings. And so in this area, it could be that at times and under certain circumstances, it would be wrong. For instance, if an ICE official came to the pastor of a church and said, I need a list of all your Hispanic members.
Should I give them the list?
Well, I think this is where the privilege of the pastor and the separation of church and state and the confidentiality of membership lists should have priority over the command of the government official. And obviously you shouldn't physically resist government officials, but neither do you have to give them things, at least without warrants. And I would suggest contacting the conference attorney and getting them involved so they can advocate for the confidentiality. There's something called the penitent-penitee privilege, the clergy privilege of confidentiality about matters of religion and relations between parishioners and the pastor. And we need to be careful in not giving out information that will compromise our members unnecessarily. Now, that's different than if somebody's committed a crime or suspected of violence or theft or murder. There's places for cooperation. But I think in this area, if there's just a general fishing expedition for people who might be undocumented, that we need to be more like the Egyptian midwives that you mentioned earlier, that aren't going to just volunteer victims, if you will.
So I guess we can conclude that in first instance, the Bible teaches us compassion, also teaches us to obey the laws of the land as long as they don't be in conflict with
the laws of God,
the laws of
principles
God,
of God.
Principles of God. So we have also principles versus specific rules that that we see, and we have those differences between those two types of law. And my Latin is rusty, so you can repeat the term.
Malum in se, or laws based on moral principles, versus malum prohibitum, which are just laws to kind of organize society and make it more efficient and operate in the way we prefer, but not in a way that is required by morality.
Then we can also conclude that in instances, people have lied and even committed murder and has been wrong, like in the case of Rahab. She was lying, and we're not condoning lying, but we see it in that context, and we will have the Lord deal with those instances. The same with the case of Corrie ten Boom, hiding Jews and all those who broke the law to do this moral goodness. So at the same time, we can also glean that we will not encourage illegal immigration or breaking of the law, or will be insistent in anything that it will be illegal. But at the same time, we can provide and cater for people who are in need.
Yes.
Like the Samaritan.
We have to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, and ask for the Holy Spirit to guide us as we seek to bring these various principles together and care about the humanity of our brothers and sisters, even while we show respect for our rulers.
As I was pastoring, I had to deal with several cases of deportation, and visit them in the facility. One of them was actually one of my neighbors, he was a student at Andrews, and there was a very unfair way of him being treated, and he was finally deported. But we will visit him, we encourage him, send letters. We can provide legal counsel and make sure that the rights of that person, because they have rights. That doesn't mean, even though they are undocumented, that they have rights. So we have to make sure and I guess avoid the ostracizing and making our brethren who are undocumented, whatever their circumstances, even if we have the difficult conversations, but pointing and taking the stone because I am not sinless, right? And I have my own share of problems.
Well, and you've said before that there are legal frameworks to all of this, and there's been such a flood of executive orders and the undoing of old executive orders, and some of these executive orders are themselves not entirely lawful, it would seem. There's been an attempt to change constitutional standards with executive order, which isn't allowed, which isn't constitutional, but a lot of this may have to be battled through the courts. And there's going to be a lot of confusion in the court system, in the government, even among the police, the immigration officials. And so we're committed. I'm a director of a Center for Law and Public Policy at Washington Adventist University. And we've already been communicating with church leadership and other immigration resources. We're going to be working on materials to help churches understand their rights and responsibilities in relation to their immigrant members, and also to help those members know their rights and responsibilities, what can be done, what legal recourses they have, so that we can handle this most effectively and responsibly in this rapidly changing environment. So we'll keep you informed as to when these resources become available, and your listeners too can stay up with that.
Indeed, indeed. We are with the crowd. Perhaps the mob is around us. We hear the shouting. I guess, what will you do? Are you going to shout also what she deserves, what he doesn't deserve? Are you going to have a stone in your hand? Well, Nick, I see somebody that was a refugee writing in the sand, and I am ashamed of the things that I have done. So I guess I will pray today for our government, for our officials. I will pray for those who are right now struggling, those who depend back home from the work that these people are doing tirelessly. I guess I drop my rock and I walk away.
Well, we're surrounded by two crowds, aren't we? We're surrounded by the mob that wants the blood and the punishment, but we're also surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses who are the moral heroes of the past in the Bible, in church history, the moral example of those like William Wilberforce and Ellen White and John Byington, who ran a stop on the Underground Railway. And they point us to doing things that take moral courage in the name of our common humanity. And it's a question of which crowd we are going to listen to.
So I guess I was wrong. I should not just walk away. You're pushing me that I should take my coat, because most likely she's naked.
Partially clothed anyway, yeah.
And so I will take my clothes. I will try to help her. I will try to understand and listen to her. And then we're going to imitate Jesus.
Amen.
Thank you, Nick.
All right.
It's been a great honor to have you with us, and we're looking forward for more opportunities to inform each of those who are part of IATS, not only here in Interamerica, but worldwide. Thank you.
Very good. God bless you, Efraín, and your podcast and your influence here, and thank you for this time.
Yeah.